Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating contrast that currently defines one of the world's fastest-growing major economies. Have you ever noticed how a country can look like an absolute superpower from the outside, but then when you look inside, the picture is completely different? Well, we're going to look at India's current strategic maneuvers on the world stage and see how they are directly colliding with its domestic realities. It's a story of soaring geopolitical ambition, massive international trade deals, and a domestic foundation that is honestly facing some very real, very pressing challenges.
So I want to dive into this by asking you a question that might sound a little, well, out there at first glance. How exactly does a maritime conflict in the Middle East connect to youth unemployment in India? I mean, it sounds like two completely different worlds, right? But as you'll see today, the global economy is just deeply intertwined. We're going to take a macro to micro journey, starting way out in international waters and ending up right in the local job markets of India's youngest workers.
Here's how we're going to break it down today. First, global choke points in trade. Second, strengthening the Indo-Pacific. Third, the landmark India-UK CETA. Fourth, who actually wins in the CETA. And finally, number 5, India's Gen Z job crisis.
All right, let's jump straight into part 1, global choke points and trade. Let's start with the widest possible lens here, the extreme fragility of international waters. The Strait of Hormuz is an absolutely critical choke point for global oil and trade. It's like a major artery. When disagreements over control and navigation rights spark up here, it sends literal shockwaves through the entire global supply chain, and that directly impacts major energy-dependent economies like India.
To put this in perspective, back in June, a brief U.S.-Iran ceasefire and memorandum of understanding collapsed, and they collapsed fast. Iran created a new authority, the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, essentially planning to charge transit tolls. The U.S. and the Gulf Cooperation Council strongly opposed this, arguing, you can't just monetize international straits. Multilateral talks in Doha completely failed. And then, the situation escalated to Iran attacking ships, including an India-bound carrier loaded with liquefied natural gas. The U.S. responded with countermeasures, and suddenly, global supply chains are heavily militarized. So for a country like India, securing these supply chains isn't just some abstract theory anymore. It is an urgent, absolute necessity.
Which brings us to Section 2, strengthening the Indo-Pacific.
That urgent need for security is exactly why India is aggressively seeking diversified partnerships closer to home, starting with Australia. Militarily, they've set up a new joint declaration on defense and security cooperation and a maritime security collaboration roadmap for the Indian Ocean. They are actively building resilience against the exact kind of choke point threats we just talked about. But economically, it's just as huge. We're talking energy security agreements enabling Australian uranium exports for peaceful purposes and massive financial commitments. For instance, Australia's largest pension fund is investing roughly 3,360 crore rupees into India's National Investment and Infrastructure Fund. It's a totally comprehensive approach. Secure the waters, secure the energy, secure the capital.
Moving right along to Section 3, the landmark India-UK CETA.
Now that we've seen India securing its regional backyard, let's look at a massive global economic pivot. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA, signed with the UK in July 2025. $120 billion. That staggering number is the ambitious goal to literally double bilateral trade between India and the UK by 2030 as a direct result of this deal. This is one of the most comprehensive trade deals signed in the post-Brexit era, and it signals a massive shift in economic alignment. Now, CETA is not your grandfather's trade agreement. It goes way beyond just shipping physical goods back and forth. It dives into services, investments, and mobility. For the very first time ever, India has opened up its e-procurement market, which is estimated at £38 billion annually, to UK businesses on a non-discriminatory basis. It also simplifies rules of origin, meaning smaller businesses and online enterprises can export with far less paperwork. They even included chapters on anti-corruption, labor standards, and gender equality in trade. It really covers the whole shebang.
But the crucial point here is that this deal relies heavily on human capital, drastically easing cross-border work. The agreement allows for temporary business visas for Indian professionals to render services in the UK. We're talking everyone from architects and IT experts to yoga instructors and chefs. But the real game changer? It's the Double Contribution Convention. This gives a 3-year Social Security waiver to temporary workers. It essentially saves hundreds of millions of dollars by eliminating duplicate Social Security payments. That is a massive reduction in the administrative burden for businesses and employees alike.
So, Section 4. Who wins in the CETA?
Okay, so big numbers and big promises. But who actually benefits from all this? For India, the win on paper is massive. A staggering 99% of India's exports to the UK will enjoy duty-free access. 99%. We're talking about labor-heavy sectors like textiles, leather goods, gems and jewelry, and marine products. By eliminating duties that used to range from 4 to 16%, Indian artisans and manufacturers get this massive competitive advantage over regional rivals like Vietnam and Indonesia when selling into the high-value UK market.
And on the flip side, well, Scotch whiskey lovers in India can definitely rejoice. Tariffs that were a steep 150% will drop down to 40% over the next 10 years. Similarly, tariffs on high-end British cars, which were sitting over 100%, are going to drop to just 10% under a quota system. The UK's high-growth sectors like automobiles, electrical circuits, and medical devices are poised for a serious boost in the Indian market.
But, as you know, free trade is rarely entirely free. Both nations very carefully shielded their most sensitive domestic industries. India protected its dairy, apples, gold, and strategic tech like smartphones and optic fibers. Meanwhile, the UK refused to budge on agricultural protections for sugar, pork, chicken, and eggs, mainly because they feared cheaper Indian imports would hurt British farmers. So it's a very calculated balancing act.
Oh, and there's one major piece of the puzzle still missing. Despite CETA's success on trade, a formal bilateral investment treaty, or BIT, is still pending. India actually unilaterally terminated dozens of BITs a few years ago due to concerns over investor-state dispute settlements. Basically, these are international courts that allow foreign companies to sue governments over policy changes. The UK wants robust protection for its investors, while India wants to protect its sovereign taxation rights. Both sides have agreed to keep working on it, but it just goes to show that total, long-term economic alignment is still very much a work in progress.
And that brings us to our final section. Number 5. India's Gen Z job crisis.
We've seen India navigating global supply chains and signing $120 billion trade deals that rely on skilled professionals. Agreements like CETA promise to create massive industries, but to fuel that engine, India needs human capital. And data from the Periodic Labor Force Survey reveals a glaring domestic challenge. While millennial labor participation is a really robust 75%, for Gen Z, that's the roughly 29.94 crore working-age youth in India born between 1997 and 2012, it plummets to just 41.7%. Now, sure, part of this is because a large chunk of Gen Z is still in school, but it also points to a very real delay and struggle in actually entering the workforce.
And for those who are trying to enter the workforce, the statistics reveal a pretty surprising paradox. There is a 29% unemployment rate specifically for male Gen Z individuals who actually have a graduate-level education or above. For females, it's even higher at nearly 37%. This highlights a severe, growing mismatch between the education young Indians are receiving and the actual jobs that are available in the market.
Plus, the problem isn't just finding a job, it's the quality of the job itself. Even when Gen Z does find work, it is largely informal. Only 20.1% of Gen Z workers have any Social Security coverage, and a mere 17.3% have actual contractual employment. This widespread insecure employment leaves the vast majority of young workers without basic safety nets or any real job stability.
So if we summarize the structural gaps facing this demographic, we see some pretty wild trends. Interestingly, rural labor participation actually outpaces urban participation for Gen Z. That's mostly because urban youth delay entry for more education, while rural youth are often forced to enter the workforce much earlier. We also see massive gender disparities. Rural male participation is nearly 60%, but rural female participation is just 28%. The pathways from school to work are just fundamentally weak right now. To fix this, there's a desperate need for formal hiring incentives, better apprenticeships, and much safer urban employment opportunities, particularly for women. Which leaves us with this final overarching question to wrap up our explainer. Can India secure its demographic dividends to match its rising geopolitical and economic status? We've seen how India is masterfully navigating global choke points in the Middle East, cementing security ties with Australia, and signing landmarked $100 billion trade deals with the UK. But a nation's global maneuvers can only soar as high as its domestic foundation allows. If the Gen Z job crisis isn't solved, that demographic dividend could very quickly become a demographic deficit. It is a high-stakes balancing act, and the whole world is watching to see if India can pull it off. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I encourage you to keep questioning how the global and the local are always connected.